Never has it felt more true that it takes a Blizzard to make a Blizzard game. And in 2020, it became clear that it's time.
Did you say
for the
it
people
takes a
who
Blizzard
work
to
here.
make a Blizzard?
And I continue to also have news for our Diablo community. Some of you
Imagine if he
were
just
able
skips the
to dip
Overwatch,
your
where he's just
toes
like,
into
no
the
mention.
depths of hell
Overwatch.
in the Diablo
Move
Immortal
on.
technical. So, only the beginning of the year.
They
and
actually
already
skipped
there is
Overwatch!
So much to look forward to.
I was
Even
joking!
though we can't yet be together.
I was joking! This is what we got. First of all, let me just go through this. So, and I'm gonna, before I go over it, my biggest takeaway for all you guys is basically Overwatch is a game for the casuals. It's kind of been like danced around. It's been danced around, and it's a meme. But Overwatch is now officially a game. Like, it's not a competitive esport. I told you guys, I said this was my instinct before the stream, and I'm 100% sure now. It is not a competitive esport. It's not a competitive game. It's a game you play to chill. It's a game you play for fun. And if you want to try a little bit more of a challenging game, you can play comp. But it is not an esport anymore. Or if it ever was. It was trying to be everything. It was trying to be like have your cake and eat it too. It wanted to be an esport. It wanted to be a casual fun game. Overwatch 2 is clearly a PvE. You play with like up to 4 friends. That's it. Everything about what they announced was all about the story missions. Now, the story missions looked amazing, right? They looked awesome in theory. Of course, we have to wait and see how that theory fulfills itself. No, I'm not saying this because of the Ryan change. I'm saying this because they never mentioned a single item about what Overwatch 2 PvP will look like. All they talked about was a few changes, but just if we were to break down, and maybe we will at some point, how much time was spent talking about PvP stuff versus PvE stuff. The PvE was basically like, if there was 45 minutes, 40 minutes was basically on how they're spending their time in the story missions. And that's how even Jeff said, right? We spent a lot of time in 2020. We spent a lot of time working on null sectors. So that's basically what it is, right? They've been spending their time. This is the reason, this is the reason why I don't think we have gotten content, why we obviously didn't get announced any new content for Overwatch 1, and why we probably won't get much more content coming for the next while is because they're not working on new content, right? The question everyone was saying is, because I heard this a lot, right? People were like, well, if they're making new heroes and they're making new maps, why don't they just drop them for Overwatch 1 now? Because I don't think they're making new heroes and make maps for the PvP side. They're first and foremost making maps, making hero designs. In fact, I'm not even sure they will, by the looks of it, they barely worked on new heroes there. They're basically spending their time making the PvE missions, which is why they haven't just been like, here, take a map that we worked on, because they haven't finished a map for the PvP. They haven't finished a bunch of heroes that they have developed for the PvE, which is why we haven't gotten that new hero. So I'm going to quickly go over this. Then what I'm going to do is we're going to look back at because I've got the same slideshow up for the stuff that we predicted before and what we said would be good and what would be bad. And I'm going to come back and we're going to discuss this. So, what was announced? This was basically these two sentences were the most important if you're a PvP player. If you care about the PvP, this is the most important information. Role passives. Tanks gets knockback reduction. DPS gets speed. Supports get basically a version of Mercy Heal. What does this mean? I think this probably means that although on the surface level, this suggests, oh, well, tanks are going to be really unique and DPS are going to be really unique and supports are going to be really unique. That's great. But I was trying to think about this as they were saying how this will play out in the game. It will basically make all the roles similar. Even though they have passives, it's going to make all the roles operate more similarly because basically what's the function of tanks getting a knockback reduction is basically lets them get closer and fight and brawl more, which is what they want, right? They don't want tanky tanks, and Jeff even said this. He was like, we don't want... I literally called it before the stream. I said that they would go on stream and say how they don't want tanks to be tanky, and they want tanks instead to be more brawly and DPSy. That's exactly what Jeff said. He said, we don't want tanks to be tanky, we want them to be brawly, and we want them to get up in there. So that's what this does, which is basically to make them thick DPS. As we've kind of noticed in Overwatch 1, is basically make them thick DPS. They just run in, they fight, and they're not really there for protection so much as they are to do damage, which is why DPS are getting a speed buff so that they don't actually have to rely on protection, right? So if DPS don't need protection, they can run around faster, they can flank more, they can get kills more, and all these changes are basically going to make everyone more self-reliant, which is exactly why they've decided to give all the supports a Mercy passive heal. This is, of the 3 changes, this is maybe the worst. This basically completely, I mean, actually, let me put a quick pin in this that says this was all theory. They never actually said they were 100% going to do any of this. And they explicitly said, as I noted down here, we are down to reinvestigate. We are down to reinvestigate any of these decisions. So they actually, and this is why I said this game is not coming out anytime soon. None of what they said they had actually decided on. It wasn't even, you know, before, when we go back to the slide, we talked about, oh, well, maybe we'll get a early 2022 release. I now really doubt early 2022 is, I would be shocked if this comes out anytime before like November 2022. You know how they said in the last BlizzCon, we'll still be talking to you about Overwatch 2 next BlizzCon. I think they're still going to be talking to us about Overwatch 2 the next BlizzCon in 2022. They might have another BlizzCon in November of this year. But considering how much they basically still haven't decided, like they still haven't decided large core elements of the game. How can they finish the game? And they've got so much that it sounds so ambitious. It sounds so ambitious what they're trying to do. They want story mission. Actually, we'll get to that later. I'll get to that in a sec. I don't want to jump the gun. Let's just finish talking about this. Supports getting self-heal basically means, again, they don't have to rely on peels. So the PvP experience is basically going to be, it's going to be better in bronze, silver, and gold, basically. You know how you're an Ana and you complain that you never get peeled for in bronze? Well, at least now in a couple seconds, you'll start to self-heal like Mercy, right? And as a Rhine, or a tank, you know how you're complaining about nobody follows up and I get, you know, burst down and killed? Doesn't matter, go on a flank because they can't knock you back, so you just run up into them. Oh, well, DPS, you're saying how your tanks never move in, you never get protection? Just run around faster so you can get to health packs quicker, you can flank easier. So this is going to make the game basically more accessible and more easy if it goes through. Remember, it's not guaranteed that these go through. And even this though, but even this, it basically perfectly encapsulates this mentality, right? It perfectly encapsulates this. Why would you want to give Ryan 2 fire stacks and a charge? Well, if you want to make him more of a solo carry character, right? If you want to make him someone who gets frags on his own and can basically charge a bit more stupidly and get away with it. This is, you know, people have mentioned canceling charge for a long time, and I've always been against it, even as a Reinhardt player, because I think it's good form of punishment of a risky decision. They're basically taking the risk out of it. They're taking the risk out of charge to say, just be able to do whatever you want. You know, just go for crazy flanks and you can cancel it if you get it wrong. So all of this suggests they want Overwatch 2 to be a more self-reliant game. They want you to play the game and not have to rely on your teammates. That is what all of this says to me. And they probably realize, I think this is what's going on in the Blizzard team. They've obviously realized that the biggest frustration of the Overwatch community is getting into a game and being frustrated with your teammates and how uncoordinated they are and how unknowledgeable they are, how toxic they are. And they have multiple options, right? Maybe a lot of us in the community have said, well, make team playing easier, make tournaments easier, make group finding easier, make stacking easier, give a team queue. So all the things to make the team play elements more easy. However, they've gone the other way, which is to say, well, rather than trying to force team, and I'm not saying it's inherently bad or inherently good, this is the decision they've made. So fair play to them, is their game, they can make whatever decision they want with it. They've decided, I'm just trying to explain how I see it, they've decided that rather than do that, they would rather just make the solo aspect of the game feel easier. So rather than make a team queue, they've decided, why not just make solo queuing easier by making all the heroes self-reliant and able to get frags and get out on their own. That is my assessment, because we didn't get a lot of information about what PvP changes they'll come, but this is the main takeaway from the direction they're going towards. Again, remember, none of this is confirmed. None of this is 100%. They may change their minds and they may cancel a lot of this. But from what they suggested, the direction they're looking at is making everybody self-sufficient. So we confirmed that they have Rome and New York City maps coming in, but again in Overwatch 2, not coming for this game. Maybe no CP. So this again is very indicative to me of this again. And I'm not trying to pat myself on the back and say that like, yeah, I called it, but like again, basically taking 2 CP is the worst mode when played solo and the most interesting mode at pro level, right? It's like the worst in solo queue because no one groups up and it's really horrible to actually like break through the spawn advantage. But it makes for very interesting games when there's a very coordinated team because it requires very specific tactical executions. So taking no 2 CP out basically says, from Jeff's perspective, again, I don't really want you to worry about teaming up. I want you to just get into the game and have fun. Which is, again, it's fair perspective. That's their perspective. They're allowed to have that perspective. We may disagree. Some of you watching may disagree. Personally, I probably disagree too. I'd rather they go for the teamwork point of view. But they've decided, just make solo the way. Make solo queue the way. Rather than forced teaming, just make solo queue the way. So take 2 CP out, the most frustrating solo game, circumvent the problem altogether. Now we get, after that basically, after that bits of information, all this is about the PvE content, which is why, like I was saying, it's all to do with the PvE. All they're really interested in right now, from what I can see, is PvE. Actually, I'm going to go back on this, because I'm going to go back and come to this. Let me go back now. And we're going to talk about our predictions that we made. So these were the predictions that we made before Blizzcon. So Overwatch 2 is delayed. Basically, they didn't say anything about when Overwatch 2 is coming out, but we know it's not coming out anytime soon. New hero or map for Overwatch 1, not met. This expectation was not met. No beta, this expectation was met. So this is NA, because they didn't really say anything. This was not met. New cinematic, not met. New patch, not met. Showcase push, not met. Some news about Overwatch 2 in its format, skill tree. We got this. We got a lot of this. Now, surprisingly good. Yeah, I never really thought this would happen, but yeah. Release date window, not met. Multiple new heroes. We know that there's going to be multiple new heroes, but not this was meant in specifics to this game. Not met. Not met. Full details on format changes, not met. It wasn't full details. We got details, but they were all hypothetical details. Not met. Early guild system, not met. Paris Horizon reworks, not met. So nothing in the surprisingly good category was met. Surprisingly bad, no Overwatch 2 news. So that was not met, which is good. In this case, it's good. No new content confirmed until the release of Overwatch. I'm going to put a tick. It wasn't confirmed. Actually, I'm going to put like a maybe on that. That's like a maybe. We'll leave that uncrossed. Details of Overwatch 2 that are terrible choices. No, that was not. We didn't get any terrible choices. We didn't get much about choices. No gameplay or cinematic, met. No acknowledgement of content or silence. I mean, they didn't acknowledge that there was a content drought. They just kind of skirted around the issue and said, oh, we know you're patient, we know you're waiting, but let's just talk about PvE shit. Actually, gameplay, okay, yeah, we'll give gameplay a met. We'll give gameplay a met, but cinematic was not met. So if we go back on what we predicted in BlizzCon, this is worse on net. This is worse than we expected, basically. And I'm not saying that in retrospect. This is exactly why we made this beforehand, to get an idea, because I felt like we made a pretty fair list and most of our expectations were not met. We didn't get any new content for Overwatch 1. We didn't get confirmed details about Overwatch 2, when it's going to come or anything like that. We got some hypotheticals and a lot of insight into what kind of stuff they're trying to do, but nothing concrete and nothing that has given us a sort of idea of when and what is happening with the game. Like, the big picture question is, we don't know what's happening with this game. So now, going back to this, now this is what I mean. They're basically all in on the PvE. They're all in on the PvE. 100 hero missions is ridiculous if it isn't their main focus. Like, think about it now. Compare it to now. Right now, our PvE missions are throwaway. Like, they're like nice little events. But does anyone really care? And even when you play them, they have like the replayability of like maybe 2 times before you get bored. This is making an attempt to make the PvE missions a big feature. I'm both excited but worried about the idea of 100 hero missions, because the hero missions should be replayable, right? We want the hero missions to be arguably infinitely replayable. If we think about any sort of like roguelikes, as they referred to earlier, like a Hades, because Hades is a very recent example. Hades, you can play as many times as you want. potentially, right? There's a near infinite number of times you can play it. What I feel they're trying to do with these is maybe too ambitious. It's like it sounds too much and it sounds too shallow because it would be too much otherwise. Because if you make, let's say like this, right? If you make 5 missions, those missions are going to be really fleshed out. They're going to be like super detailed. Every time you go in, it's like a new game. Every time, or like a new mission, and every time you play it, there's like it's fresh and exciting. But if you have 100 missions, they're going to be surface level. Like there's no way we've seen the speed of content output that they've had. There's no way that these 100 missions are like super deep and fleshed out. Like they talked about a few things that will change. So this is where they tried to like elaborate on how things change. You know, there's like sometimes it's a gather and return, sometimes it's payload, sometimes it's a wall of death, sometimes it's a scavenger hunt, and sometimes it's a kill quest. If there's only like, let's say there's like 20 different enemies you can come up against, and there's 5 different modes that you can play, that's, you know, that's a limited number of things that can come up. Gather and return, if you've done it once, you know what a gather and return is. Like anyone who's played an MMO knows how boring like fetch and run quests, as they're called, or fetch and gather quests get after a while, right? Like you go run for an object, you get it, you bring it back. Payload, we've all played payload, we know what this is like. Wall of death, we've all played battle royale games, we know what this is like. Scavenger hunt, again. Kill quest, again. These are modes that like will quickly run out. Like unless the mission itself is making itself very fresh every time, these objectives will not be enough to like refresh our interest. So I'm a little bit worried, but they sound like they're very much into it. I'm a little bit worried that these make it sound like it's basically 100 archive missions, but a little bit better. And, you know, they have a little bit more replayability. If the mission is not exciting, it doesn't matter what talents you bring into it, right? If you're not compelled to play the mission multiple times, you're not going to be that bothered about like, I guess I'll play the same boring mission but with different talents. Like, no. So the missions have to be something that are exciting and reinvigorating, and they like refresh themselves every single time. Who knows how that pans out, but the scope that they had was vast. Everything that they suggested was like massive scope. I would love it if they realized those ideas. I would be it would genuinely, from what they said and what they promised, not promised, but suggested, it sounds like an amazing game. But of course, if there's anything we've learned from recent game releases, it's that promises mean shit. Promises don't mean shit. It doesn't matter if they promised a whole bunch of cool effects and facial movements and knockbacks of one drone onto another and the environment changing. If none of that actually is concrete, if none of that actually holds up when the game comes out. We got some new looks, which great, it was really nice, but the amount of time they spent talking about that was just like way too disproportionate. 5 games in 1 is basically the summary of what I would say is what they want Overwatch 2 to be. They want it to be a PvP game. They want it to be an esport. They want it to be a roguelike. But they also want it to be like an RPG campaign that's like a story, like has a story element. We've basically been fighting the philosophy of Overwatch, like what Overwatch is meant to be, right? Like, and I would say like underneath all of these, we could probably put the subheading of like team and versus solo. MOBAs are much more heavily a team game, whereas your generic shooter is usually much more solo based. So I think of any battle royale game, they're all about like, okay, yeah, you might have a squad of 3, but at the end of the day, it's all about you fragging out. Or like a Valorant, of course, at the top level, it's about very precise executions, but still at the end of the day, you have that ability to like 1v3, 1v4, 1v5 frag out. We've always wrestled with this, like where we want to go. Do we want to go MOBA side? Do we want to go shooter side? I'd say that to start with, Overwatch wanted to be somewhere in the middle. One of the devs said, we wanted to have that uniquely Overwatch feel. That is basically the motto of Blizzard. We want everything to have the unique feel of like, this is our thing. We don't just take stuff, we add a spin on it. And that is both Blizzard's greatest strength and their biggest weakness, generally and historically, is that they're incredibly determined, stubborn, whatever words you want to use, to make sure that everything they do has the Blizzard stamp on it, right? Everything is like the Blizzard way. Sometimes that means they produce an amazing game, but other times it means that rather than just take what is clearly and obviously the right decision from a different game, they will figure out some obtuse way of making the same change that actually doesn't work because they want to do it the Blizzard way. you know, I would say at launch they wanted the game to be somewhere in between, right? There was MOBA characters. You had your Reinhardts, your Winstons, your Mercies, but you also had your shooter characters, the Widowmakers, the McCrees, the Genji. Like Genji, although not a traditional shooter character, but of that ilk, right? Like again, in shooters you can also put like games like Quake, where Farah comes from, where you wanted, you know, some sort of mechanically demanding game. Whereas MOBAs, although mechanically demanding, are in a different way, and they require execution of tactical abilities and team play. So that's basically what you're wrestling with. When you pull towards the MOBA side, you're emphasizing team play and using your abilities in the right way together, which is what GOATS was basically peak MOBA Overwatch, right? And it was all about doing everything correctly with your teammates and using your cooldowns properly, because you basically had the same 6 characters and whoever used their cooldowns better won. Compare that to now, I would say the opposite of this is probably double off tank meta. So I'm just gonna call it DOM. Double off tank meta was basically the peak shooter. And honestly, the longer the game has gone on, the more we've pulled in this direction, particularly over the last, I would say, 2 years. Right, since 222 came in, they've been pushing and pushing and pushing in this direction. The double off tank meta basically was 0 tanks, right? There was 0 actual tanking going on. It was about Zarya and Hog flanking and doing damage, or playing Wrecking Ball and Hog or something. That was as close to like a shooter that we've gotten so far. I think they're trying to go all the way. I think we're going to go even farther towards this, where every character is basically either like a pure shooter character or is a in-your-face brawl kind of character. I think they basically want Reinhardt to be more like Doomfist, rather than to be like launch Reinhardt or to be like original Orisa. What we saw in the clip is basically, we saw 800 shield, right? We watched 800 shield HP, the ability to charge and cancel it, and 2 fire strikes. So he's basically much more aggressive, much more about getting kills, and much more about like getting straight quickly to swing and fight rather than actually shielding for any significant amount of time. Again, none of this is inherently good or inherently bad. It's about the philosophy. It's about what are you trying to do with the philosophy of Overwatch. And whether you think it's good or bad is up to you, is your own personal perspective. Blizzard have obviously decided that they don't like the GOAT's MOBA Overwatch. They like the shooter Overwatch. And as a consequence, they like solo Overwatch. They want Overwatch to fundamentally be played in solo queue. We've had this question as well, as like, are we a team game or are we a solo game? And from what we suggested, it's all about going solo. So basically, Blizzard has decided, from what I gather, that with Overwatch 2, they're going to push towards making it more of a shooter game, but for casuals. This is probably the key here. Casuals. And I know this is a pejorative term. People often use this derogatively. And I'm not trying to use it derogatively. But it must be acknowledged that basically they want it to be a shoot stuff, fight stuff, kill stuff game, but for casual players. But for players who just want a solo queue, and the players who are playing the new story missions and then also decide to dip in to the comp aspect. That's what I gathered. That's the conclusion I would take from what we heard at Overwatch 2. Is it's primarily a PvE game, shooter, like with more shooter elements and more brawly fight stuff. Less nuance of like knowing abilities, playing around abilities, and more about you fight stuff. It was a little bit Pepega, some of the shit that went on today. Like some of the stuff was a little bit too funny, where they completely ignored Overwatch at the start, and there were some funny moments, especially with the article as well from Jeff. But overall, I think what's come is for the worse right now, but for the better in the long run. It's like, it feels rough right now. No content. Overwatch 2, so heavily focused on PvE and not PvP. No clear direction of like PvP changes, and seemingly a nod. Everything was nodding towards a sort of more accessible game, which sounds rough for us right now because we are very invested in the game. But I genuinely think in the long run, it's going to be good for the game. It's going to be good for the popularity of the game. And hopefully we can all have fun with the game in a different way as it evolves. So that's my perspective on it, guys.